Good afternoon and welcome to the last breakout session and the second last session of today's conference. My name is Herbert Dieter from AGI, and we'll be talking about a relatively simple topic, which is the outlook for global trade. That seems to be much easier than some of the previous topics, but certainly it is not an easy topic. It is not easy because what I would like to suggest is there is a declining support for liberal trade in many societies, in particular in OECD societies. The support for globalization, broadly defined, it seems to be disappearing. The new friends of globalization are, not surprisingly, in those countries that are currently benefiting quite a bit from globalization. The new friends of globalization are in what you would call the South. And I have one piece of evidence for that. A poll taken in 2016 asked, and it was one of the few rather global polls, it asked, is globalization good for your country? Not for you personally, but for your country. And the highest pro returns were recorded in countries like India, where 83% of the people asked said globalization is good for their country, the Philippines 85%, and Vietnam 91%. By contrast, in the Old West, in the OECD countries, the United States, Great Britain, but also, of course, Eastern European countries, there was very limited support for globalization and liberal trade. And the trouble is, and I don't blame policymakers for that, policymakers have to respond to this rather lukewarm support for liberal trade. Alan Blinder, the American economist, earlier this year asked, and this is one of the issues we should consider, he asked why economists have failed to consider the producer side of globalization. In particular, in the United States of America, economists were stressing the benefits of liberal trade for consumers. But many economists fail to consider the, at times, negative effects on producers. And this is something that someone like Paul Samuelson in his last piece in 2004 addressed when he suggested that China's integration into the global economy is a game changer. It will, and this is what Blinder said, it is equal to the mass immigration of unskilled labor to the United States. The effects are the same. He was, of course, referring to his own 1947 article on a factor equalization. Today, and this is what we are going to discuss today, we have a backlash against globalization. In particular, low-skilled people in OECD countries are saying, this is not my kind of globalization. We want to be protected against the negative effects of unrestricted trade, and that makes it difficult to maintain the current system. Before I introduce the panel, a last quotation from Francis Fukuyama and a piece that he published in Foreign Affairs in 2016, in August 2016, so after Brexit, but before Trump. And he said this backlash against globalization could have been predicted. He himself argued that he is only surprised by the fact that it took so long, but not by the fact that it is happening. We have four distinguished panelists, and I won't introduce them in detail. What I would like to introduce to you is where they got their PhDs from. So we have an American dominance here on the panel when it comes to PhDs. We have Mari Pangestu with a PhD from UCL at Davis. We have Zhigang Tao with a PhD from Princeton. We have Vinod Aggarwal with a PhD from Stanford. And the big exception is, of course, Patrick Lowe with a PhD from Sussex. But it's, we have Anglo-Saxon PhDs on this panel, and I'm sure this will also provide to the entertainment. We have the following agreement. We have reversed the order Marie Pangestu will start. Each panelist has 5 minutes for an introductory statement, and then we'll engage in a debate, and of course in a debate with you as well. Marie, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'd like to perhaps start the discussion rolling, and even though you are emphasizing the Anglo-Saxon backgrounds of all of us, this is definitely not an Anglo-Saxon view that I'm going to be presenting. I'm pretty much going to present the ASEAN or the East Asian view on the trade outlook as we see it, and more importantly, what we should be doing about it. Now, a lot has been said about the context that we're having this discussion, but just to emphasize, I think you also already emphasized the anti-globalization, the trade war, which is also underlining the withdrawal of the US leadership from the rules-based multilateral trading system. And I woke up this morning when I turned on the television, it said that the US is threatening to not approve the budget for the WTO. So that's just another piece of news in case you missed it. And we know that there's great uncertainty which has impacted the world economic outlook. You know, the IMF, I think, has, I don't know how many times, revised downwards its world growth projection. I think it's went from 3.9 to 3% in the last 12 months. And trade growth also has been falling. And disruption of GVCs, as Victor pointed out this morning. And I think we know the world has changed. We have a multipolar world. We have challenges to globalization, especially, to use the words of Mike Spence, catastrophic inequality that we have to deal with. And you know, we are living in the middle of it with the protests and political outcomes of extreme left to right. So what is, and for a country like Indonesia, we worry a lot about China's slowdown. 1% slowdown in China means 0.3% decline in growth for Indonesia. So because of the impact on trade, commodity prices, and so on. So this is real. So for us, the survival, what's the survival instinct? We have to survive. This is not, to use Andrew, Andrew's not here. I was going to pick up on his coming from the island of Borneo. I don't come from the island of Borneo. We have a part of Borneo, but we have 16,999 islands on top of Borneo. We are a relatively large country in the Southeast Asia, the largest country in Southeast Asia, but we have to survive. So the two elephants are fighting. We don't want to be trampled. We have to be nimble and get out of the way, and we don't want to be made to choose. The moment we choose, one of the elephants is going to slap us down, right? And Australia being an example we do not want to follow. I don't know whether you followed this, but when Australia kind of, I think they banned Huawei, or was it ZTE? One of those. And then the Chinese thought, well, maybe we should reduce our import of coal from Australia. You know, so be forewarned. We don't want to have to choose between Huawei or whatever, or BRI and whatever, right? We don't want to be asked to choose, just as Andrew pointed out. So what's our survival instinct? So I'm going to provide you with my three-pronged response coming from a Southeast Asian perspective. And it is a response to survive. I think one of the speakers this morning said, for China to we need trade, we need global value chains. Similar with Asia. So to continue to develop, we have to continue trade, investment, and openness. But at the same time, we have to address challenges and risks related to inequality and technology, which is the conversation of all this morning. So I want to propose my three-pronged approach based on 3 principles. So 3 and 3. 3 principles. We need to move on. We can't be dragged down and let the grass get trampled until there's nothing left. So no more grass, and we can't continue. So we have to move on, but at the same time, strengthen and improve. And improve means the rules that need to be improved, which is the fundamental issues underlying the US-China trade tensions. who was it? I think it was Rob who said we should thank Trump for waking us all up and recognizing that these were weaknesses that were recognized long before Trump came on the scene. And the other thing you have to improve is how you address equity, whether it's within nations or between nations. And the second principle, collective leadership. This is what we've been talking about in ASEAN and East Asia. Building on existing platforms. Let's not reinvent new institutions and platforms. And finally, we have to continue to engage US and China. Whether they're fighting or not, or whether they're dancing with each other, we still have to continue to engage. So my three-pronged approach in brief. First of all, unilateral reforms. We have to continue. We have to change systems and institutions. That's the big thing to get out of the middle income trap. Some of it is the traditional continued opening up, conducive ecosystem for innovation, remove the rigidities for labor policy, education, and health so that your human capital can be upgraded, and then the challenge of the inequality. And every country will have a different source of inequality. And how do we address this? And it's about what Victor and many others have mentioned, the upward mobility of the aspiring middle class. And there's lots of studies already being done on that, and the governments needs to prioritize this. Second, regional and multilateral. Asia's role and collective leadership in existing platforms with the above principles that I mentioned. In the regional platform, ASEAN and Indonesian leadership within ASEAN, our new foreign policy has re-emphasized and emphasized this with Japan, China, and India collectively. And if Asia grows, the rest of the world grows. So it's not closed regionalism. We have to deepen our regional integration and trade agreements, whether it's in e-commerce, digital, or services, or movement of natural persons. You have demographic issues in East Asia, aging in the Northeast Asia and some ASEAN countries, but India, Indonesia, demographic dividend. So I think movement of labor is actually very important. Expand. ASEAN +1 FTAs already exist. RCEP 15. Unfortunately, not 16. India has not joined. We still, what was it? The fat lady hasn't sung. I think that was the word Suman said. So I always say, we always compare RCEP and CPTPP, right? So RCEP 15 is about India not yet joining. TPP 11 is about US already leaving, okay? So it's different. And RCEP is the beginning of your regional trade agreement. It's not the end. It's the beginning, so don't compare it to the so-called high standard of the CPTPP. It will evolve in that direction. It will improve and strengthen in that direction. Indo-Pacific, new one. Not security in the military sense, not Quad excluding China, but it's part of the East Asia Summit leaders, which will have which has US and Russia, plus the 16 economies of RCEP, so it has all the countries in there. So the economic content is actually RCEP, and the new thing that was announced at the ASEAN Summit, the Indo-Pacific outlook, and it will be focused on infrastructure. So it will be a platform that will allow BRI to come in, as well as anybody else to come in, to develop infrastructure as part of the capacity building that will address the inequity between countries, right? So the convergence of development. So capacity building is a key part of the Asian regional agreements. APEC can be used to address issues which are sensitive, like technology that Mike was mentioning, that there's no forum to talk about it. APEC, by the way, has already talked about privacy standards. It's a non-binding, voluntary, but it's still a start of a conversation. Finally, multilateral. G20 to provide the political will for WTO reforms. It has already happened, at least in the last 2 years, even though we still have to see the action. Indonesia submitted a non-paper on WTO reforms, which talks in the last G20, supported by Australia, and then finally some of it made it into the leaders as well as the trade minister's statement. And it is about strengthening the system. You can't improve the system if it doesn't exist anymore. So it's about the dispute settlement system and some of the quick wins that you could have to improve the confidence on WTO. And then a strategic framework for improving the WTO. Subsidies, you can only solve subsidies multilaterally. Transparency, competitiveness, and investment issues, developing countries' status, as well as new issue, which is the e-commerce. And you can do it plurilaterally, by sector or by issue, as long as you make it open. And I think those are some of our recommendations. And we are in survival mode. We want things to continue because we need to continue to develop, but we need to take the collective leadership role.
Yeah, thank you very much. An immediate follow-up question. You mentioned that the United States may block the budget of the World Trade Organization. Kishore earlier said the Europeans failed to convince the United States to be a bit more constructive in the World Trade Organization. Now, the World Trade Organization, as it is constructed, provides each and every member country with a blocking power. This is one of the advantages and the disadvantages of the World Trade Organization. As we see, and let's assume this will continue, the United States is rather reluctant to engage constructively at the WTO. What should the others do? What should the rest of the world do, given that the United States might choose to be a destructive force in the World Trade Organization? Someone has suggested that a while ago for the IMF, when we had a relatively similar debate in the IMF, the US was blocking the reform of voting power in the IMF, and the proposal was, well, let's just create a new one without the United States. So should the other 163 create a new World Trade Organization if those difficulties persist, or should we just sit there and wait?
I don't think it's black and white, but I can answer you at least for the dispute settlement. I haven't really thought about the budget process because the US contributes quite a lot to the WTO budget. Maybe you have to find alternative funding if you were going to have an ITO, right? An international trade organization, which is, how many members do we have? 160? 164 minus 1. That's what it means, right? So, and we were living in a G19 world at some point with the climate change and so on, so why not? On the dispute settlement, there's been two options. One is where you just continue and to nominate the judges without the US blocking it, and you can actually do that. Yeah, and then move on and continue to improve the rules, which we know we have to improve. That's one option. Some of us are very supportive of that option. The second is, in 1 month, we have to decide anyway. The second option is to just let no judges be there, but you go back to the old system, which is you have to create a panel every time you have a case. So it's not like the end of the world, but you could do that. But I think many of us are preferring the first option, but I don't know whether we all have the leadership. It would require the Asian collective leadership to have consensus on this.
But in the old system, you also needed the consent of both parties to have a panel.
Yes. So, well, you will not be able to use it if you had a dispute with the US, but you could use it if you had a dispute with the rest of the world, right? So anyway, we're doing that. In any case, we are doing this anyway. We are being very schizophrenic. We have to deal with the US in the way I think we are looking at what they're doing to China. Indonesia is also number 15 on the deficit list. So we are also experiencing the same kind of pressure. So we have to deal with the US in this transactional deal kind of way. But at the same time, we still uphold the rules and the rest of the system.
As a German, of course, I know how it feels to be on Mr. Trump's list. So, Professor Tao.
Yes, I think the Americans are not very happy. They're not happy with the Chinese, even though they were the one who teach China to go globalization 20-some years ago. Getting firms listed, through Goldman Sachs, and I still remember Ellen Blinder teaching me 33 years ago that the trade is good. You have specialization, you have fast economic growth. So economists have missed the costs of globalization because, they forgot that economists tend to focus on efficiency, right? I mean, it's all about efficiency, but then, you have to worry about equity. So the war is not going to be complete without having Americans to be on board. So the question is, To me, we basically have 2-by-2 choices, Do we want to go for more globalization or less globalization? Do we want to have more inclusion or less inclusion? And, in the past, it was more integration, but then forget about redistribution, forget about inclusion. That was the case before Trump. Now you got Trump on board. He's basically anti-trade, but then he's also anti-redistribution. He's giving tax reduction for the rich people. That's crazy, right? Now, when you look at the candidates from the Democratic parties, you have Elizabeth Warren. She's going for anti-trade and pro-redistribution. And I think the right way is actually more integration and more inclusion. And what you really need is some sort of a global governance structure, some set of agreements to tax rich people uniformly, wherever they go, okay? Tax corporations, wherever they go. Because what you really see in the last 40 years is that you see inequality within the United States, but at the same time, corporations are making a lot of money. So it is the issue of redistribution. So to fix this problem is really for the Americans to do heavy-duty redistribution and leading the world with another round of globalization. That's my short answer to your question.
So if I may follow up on that, taxing rich people seems to be more difficult than it used to be. In the days of Bretton Woods, when there were restrictions on capital flows, the top marginal tax rate in the United States was rather remarkable by today's standard. It was 91% in the days of John F. Kennedy. And that was not the top rate in the OECD. The British had a top marginal tax rate of 95, and Sweden had presented the author Astrid Lindgren in one year with a tax bill that amounted to 102% of her income, after which she decided to move to Switzerland. Now, my point here is the ability to tax income has been greatly reduced with the dismantling of restrictions on capital flows. And you suggested that we should have some global governance regime, but that would require a bit of a consensus, I dare say. As a European, I witnessed that the island in the North Atlantic that is now declaring itself independent once again has deliberately promoted or has created an economic strategy, and that is a very simple one. We want to be the Singapore, the low tax haven for Europe. So against that background, how do you envisage this kind of ability to tax income with the potential redistribution effects that you have been advocating?
I think a lot of people have actually talked about fintech, digitization of everything these days. I think it's easy for countries to trace the flow of money, to actually get to know how much money actually Jew is making, say, for example. And the Americans, they have this ability, right? Now, as to your question, smaller countries tend to, low down their tax rates because, they don't really have to show the global responsibility, right? So this is precisely, you want to have a mechanism to prevent this prisoner dilemma situation. I mean, just look at the way Amazon searched for the second headquarters in the United States, right? Cities had to compete against one another. What you need is sort of a mechanism within the United States and say, this is it. There should be some minimal level of tax concessions. And that's the way through which you can limit how much money corporations are making and making sure you have something which people call embedded liberalization. You want to have a combination of free trade and some redistribution. Yeah.
A view from California.
Thank you, Heribert. So I should just preface this by saying I'm speaking as an American, but I won't be talking only about America, and also as a political economist who's often very critical of economists, actually along some of the lines you just said, and I'll say why that's the case. So I agree with some of the things that were said in an earlier panel today, but I have to disagree on some points. So the way I'd like to present my remarks is at three levels of analysis, very traditional international relations approach. A kind of systemic level shifts domestic level shifts and ideological shifts. And the point I'm trying to make is it's not just Trump, as we heard before, it's not just about Trump. And I want to show that these secular trends at these three levels that I think will lead to continued problems between the United States, China, other countries, and protectionism for some time to come. So the first is at the systemic level. And we've seen this movement from the unipolar world, which is supposed to last forever, according to one of my political science colleagues, to a more of a bipolar world. And little was said about a multipolar world. We use this term multipolar. What does it actually mean? I mean, think about the EU as a key power. That was always the notion. As soon as they get their act together, there'll be another pole. We can keep waiting for a long time. I'd like to think about that. You know, it'll take a while for that to happen. On the other hand, we heard about India. And India, of course, is about 1/3 the size of the Chinese economy, depending on PPP, what you look at. So it's small, so it's not quite getting there. But I also heard a lot that I disagreed with about this kind of US versus Asia. This idea of Asia I find very complex. Asia is not a monolith. And we have China, we have India, we have Indonesia, we have all these countries with their own civilizations, their own populations, and the notion that somehow Asians are unified, or Asia versus the West, you know, this is a kind of Huntington idea, another bad political science idea. But you know, this notion of clash of civilizations I find very problematic. And being someone whose colleague was Kenneth Waltz, who's the father of neorealism and power politics and so on, and he and I used to talk a lot about this. I mean, looking at all these other factors are important. I'm not saying culture is not important. I'm not saying religion is not important. But Waltz's theory was basically, let's not think about these things. Let's try to focus on a theory which is somewhat sparse so we can make good predictions. And I heard this discussion, you know, whatever about the Caucasian world and so on. I'd like to say as an American, you know, whites will be in a minority in the United States pretty soon. And so I'm an American, so this idea of somehow Caucasians, okay, Indians are Caucasians. Technically, going back to a Supreme Court ruling actually in the 1920s, there was not just an Asian Exclusion Act against the Chinese, there was also an Exclusion Act against Indians. And I'd tell you a quick little story on that. So the issue was the Supreme Court ruled, well, we should keep out Indians. And somebody said, well, Indians are Caucasians. So the Supreme Court then thought about this and they said, well, we're going to use the man on the street rule. So even though anthropologically Indians are Caucasians, if people on the street see them as dark, then they're excluded. If they're fair, then they're fine. So actually Indians were then split in the United States whether they could stay or not. So we've seen a history in the United States of that, of kind of using
the
racial
wisdom of
criteria.
lawyers.
Sorry?
The wisdom of lawyers.
Wisdom of lawyers. So moving on from this kind of bipolar argument, let me talk another systemic level, the WTO, which we'll hear a lot about from Patrick Loeb. But clearly this is not new news. The Doha round was in trouble long before Trump came along. And so it's not like there was progress in the WTO on that issue. We had some other small agreements, not very important. The appellate body was criticized by the Obama administration for trying to make law, so that's been a criticism for some time. So the notion that somehow this is all due to Trump, and I'm not a Trump supporter by any means, I should point out, but the idea that this is somehow just because of Trump is inaccurate. Let me turn to the domestic level. Well, you know, people start talking about job losses, and job losses are taking place. My first book was on textile protectionism. The idea of sector-specific protectionism has a very old history, going back to the creation of the short-term agreement and long-term agreement on cotton textiles, going back to 1960-61, when it was created, and actually put in the GATT as an official kind of sub-body of the GATT. The difference is that nobody cared about textile workers losing their jobs or steel worker losing their jobs. It's only when workers in higher paying professions started losing their jobs that people got excited. So the notion that somehow people were, you know, and why is that? We'll talk about that in a minute in terms of the way economists see the world. Industrial policy. So industrial policy is really difficult. I'm not going to advocate industrial policy. It's really hard to pursue. But that doesn't mean it's impossible to pursue. And the Chinese have shown very systematically that they've been able to pursue industrial policy with some problems, of course, and so on. Japanese pursued industrial policy. Very close friend of mine who's an economist in Japan who also went to Stanford with me. I won't mention his name. Every time I discussed industrial policy with him, he said it didn't work. I went to Stanford economics. It doesn't work. So one day I said to him, I don't get it. You keep saying this? He says, yes, yes, yes. So I figured the best strategy was to get him drunk. And after I got him drunk, not too drunk, I said, so tell me about Japan. He goes, well, it worked, didn't it? So clearly it is possible to have industrial policy that works. And when liberal economists, by that I mean Chicago School economists, say, oh, industrial policy never works and so on, I think that's very misleading. A third element at the domestic level is this idea of a domestic political coalition. Who is supporting US-China engagement, cooperation, and so on? I remember I was doing some consulting for a large tech firm, and I said to them, well, so tell me, what is your strategy? Tell me about your corporate strategy before I can give you some advice. And they said, our corporate strategy is China. And I said, well, China's not a corporate strategy. China's a country. And they said, everybody's going to China. Everybody's making money. We're going to China. And I said, everybody's making money in China? Do you know that to be the case? Actually, that's not the case. Now, what do we see? US and European companies and Japanese companies and some Indian companies in the wind sector all went to China, all hoped things would work out really well. And in sector after sector after sector, look at the wind power sector, look at the solar power sector. The Chinese kept changing the rules, using government procurement, and were able to essentially keep out Western wind companies. Right? Western solar companies. They did very well through a strategy of systematic protectionism and promotion of the companies. So the notion that you can't have intervention that works is quite misleading. Just because India messed it up with ISI and had the Hindu rate of growth for 25 years doesn't mean that no one else can pursue industrial policy. The last point has to do with the ideational change. For many years, all we heard about was, benefits of growth. Economic growth is very important. Of course, when we saw NAFTA and after NAFTA, we saw the strengthening environmental movement. We saw a strengthening labor movement, and people started being more critical of free trade agreements. And I'm a big advocate of trade agreements, so I'm not encouraging those. But of course, we saw those linkages. We saw even Clinton putting in these kind of side agreements, which were pretty toothless, but still addressing the concerns of environmentalists and labor groups. So that's been a trend that's continuing. Now, what about this issue? Now, when I listen to economists these days, I am completely stunned. It's as if they threw out their whole profession, and I'm pretty old, I've been around for a while listening to economists, and every time I would talk about relative gains or distributional consequences, they would look at me like I was an alien. Now all I hear is economists talking about distributional consequences and the importance of that. Great transformation. I'll just end with one little story. I was talking to a very prominent economist who won a Nobel Prize also, and who writes for the New York Times. I can't say who he is. And what did he say to me at a lunch? He and I were having lunch with another economist, and they kept talking for a long time, and finally they got bored, and they said, Vinny, let me ask you a question, like the political scientist. I said, sure. He says, explain the stupidity of the American public. I said, sure. What's the question? In surveys, Americans would rather grow at 3% and have the Chinese grow at 2%, then grow at 4%, and have the Chinese grow at 7%. Explain why they're so stupid. And I said, it's called relative gains. If you have relative gains so that one group is gaining much faster than the other, that leads to what in economics, actually, people call positional goods. And my house in a nice part of the Bay Area is a positional good. And so therefore, my ability to purchase that house depends on other people's income as well. So the notion of relative gains and among countries, the importance of relative gains, the importance of within countries is not a new idea. Political economists have been saying this for a long time. And by the way, there was this guy who was concerned about inequity. His name was Karl Marx. I never hear about him.
A short follow-up question. As we are in Hong Kong, and as 12 years ago the WTO convened here with the ministerial meeting, and at the time civil society was very critical of world trade and of the World Trade Organization in particular, and slogans such as "kill the WTO" were used in that at that time. My question to you as a political economist is, has civil society, with a rather unreflected view of the international division of labor, contributed to that bad image that globalization and trade has today? Or is Oxfam not a player in that game?
Well, I've had my pitched battles, not of the kind that we see in Hong Kong or other places, but pitched battles, academic pitched battles, or in which I used to defend the WTO all the time, right? And they would attack the WTO, unfair to developing countries and the like. And so finally I said, okay, you don't like the WTO? Let's see how you like bilateral trade agreements, which are going to be the next thing that you have. And then you'll really be unhappy that you don't have the WTO. So there I'm a defender of the WTO, and I think civil society got it wrong by always criticizing the WTO. Sure, WTO has lots of problems, but bilateral trade agreements where countries are able to exert their power in the negotiation of an agreement are much worse for developing countries, and that's precisely why multilateralism is good for small and medium-sized countries.
Patrick, what would you say? Is multilateralism good for smaller countries?
Well, that's what everyone likes to say, but I think it's also good for big countries. I've never really bought into this idea that, relatively speaking, smaller countries are better off than bigger ones in a multilateral environment. It's just a question of who your enemies are. So as far as I'm concerned, it's not an, there are examples of where preferentialism, bilateral agreements, have done much better for countries. I'll give you an example of Colombia. Colombia, I knew the ambassador because he was a friend when he was in Geneva, and then he became the chief negotiator for Colombia. And I used to tease him every time I saw him about which part of Colombia had he given away to the North Americans this week. And that was our standing joke. But when it was all finished, we sat down and he talked very seriously about it. And he said, look, we did things that we would never have done in the WTO. And you might say that was because of arm twisting. But actually, that isn't really the story. The story is we got reciprocity from the United States because we got access to the market in a way we would never have got in the WTO. So we were prepared to do stuff on intellectual property, take a bit of an income hit on that, precisely because we had market access and it was secure market access through a free trade agreement. So I think it's, there's some subtleties to this. But yes, by and large, if you don't have the anchor or the mothership of multilateralism, I think you're in pretty bad shape.
A follow-up on your comment that you made last night on China. You suggested that it would be possible to convince China to end subsidies for state-owned enterprises, or at least that should be the goal. How do you do that? I think that would be, if that were achievable, we would all agree and would say, okay, fair enough, that is a very useful goal, and the trouble seems to be that this would alter the structure of the Chinese economy to a degree that the Chinese government seems to be unwilling to entertain. So how do you do that? I mean, this is what the big criticism Pascal Lamy and others have been raising. China is unfairly subsidizing its state-owned enterprises. Nobody knows how these channels work. And at the end of the day, these subsidized corporations compete with private corporations in OECD countries, and jobs are lost and so on and so forth, the whole story. So how do you do that? How do you convince China to end subsidies if China is unwilling?
Well, first of all, you've got to negotiate. This is a very one-sided conversation. Unfortunately, the Chinese government doesn't, I don't know why it doesn't, well, I have my ideas why, it never puts out there a decent defense. It just takes the hits. Because if you look at subsidies, just take subsidies. Vinny and a friend of his have been doing some work on looking at state-level subsidies in the US, and they are pretty large. But they don't get any attention because when they drew up the WTO, the GATT agreement, there's a little clause in there which says that federal authorities in a federal state will do their best to make the sub-federal entities behave themselves. It was only best endeavors. So with that, we don't get a proper handle on state-level support in the United States. We don't have a proper handle of state support in China either. And the Europeans have a little bit to explain as well, frankly. So I think one has to have a proper conversation, which is more than just you start behaving yourself. And it needs to be much more, we need to negotiate this thing. But what I actually said last night was slightly different. I mean, it was that there is, in my view, there is a sufficiently sharp contrast between the Chinese model and the Western model. And unless you want to decouple, unless you want to say, you go your way, we'll go our way, and we'll cut these links, we'll minimize them, if you accept that there's a game to be played with a positive outcome, then you need to look at the rules again. And it seems to me that the way through this is to change the rules on subsidies, and there are particular ways of doing that, and also to change the rules on state trading. Not going and saying the state can't own companies. You can't say you've got to be like us. When we were negotiating Chinese accession, I was working for the boss, and so we went a lot to Beijing. And quite honestly, in my view, the people in charge of those negotiations, including the Premier, actually did think convergence was on the cards. It wasn't just the West assuming that.
Zhu Rongji was assuming that convergence was the
yes, and he was doing it. He was going about it.
trajectory.
He was doing it, and then it got reversed. But now the reality is, it's ridiculous to think that you can just go to the Chinese and say, "Be like us, and everything will be fine." So you've got to renegotiate the rules of the game, and I believe that is a negotiation that could be had, but it's going to have to be an honest negotiation, because they're all sinners.
Aren't we?
They, I said.
Let me have a follow-up question on that threat of decoupling, because I mean we are not just here to express our good intentions and wishful thinking. We might also entertain for a minute or two a negative scenario, which is indeed decoupling. I find it difficult. I mean, in the Brexit debate, there was a lot of discussion on how do you organize that kind of decoupling. And I think it was a Labour member of a British Parliament who said, well, decoupling is like unscrambling an egg. And this is what would be the problem with deep coupling of China and the United States. It's not that easy. How can you, what is your scenario, or what is your kind of prospect on that? And maybe you can come in on that.
So I don't think it's binary. It's not like you're coupled or you're completely uncoupled. It would just simply be a weakening of the bilateral relationship, which would have a fallout for everybody else, by the way, which Murray was talking about. It would be that these trade restrictions are reducing trade flows between China and the United States. They've done so quite considerably. And both countries are taking hits. I think the hit for the US is a bit more delayed, but there will be a hit. In fact, that's why Trump is backing off. The decoupling is just you do less of it. But the thing is, when you do less of it, and if the trade war, the so-called trade war, is also about technology, then you get into the situation that Murray was talking about, that you're going to have to choose.
Professor Dow.
Yeah, I think decoupling is one of the 4 items in the dream deal of Donald Trump. So getting rid of the China model, that's the last one, and then decoupling, because basically, Vice President Mike Pence say we rebuild China, so Americans are very unhappy with that. And then number 3 on the item is basically technology for market is something Americans are not happy with. And the last one, which is the easiest, is getting rid of the trade deficits. I think so. Decoupling is taking place, and China is actually embracing for that, because basically, some of these low-end manufacturing, you don't want to keep these manufacturing. The Chinese are learning what the Americans have been doing in the last 40 years. What the Americans have been doing in the last 40 years is offshoring and outsourcing, right? The American corporations are making a lot of money out of that, right? But China wants to replicate that, actually proactively moving some of these factories to some of these lower cost countries. But then China has been using a different model, the state ownership model. So people are always very confused with this state ownership model, especially if you're a runner. When I'm running ahead of Petra, and Petra's using a different strategy of running against me, I feel really uncomfortable, right? I think this is the kind of feeling the Americans are having. Now, when I introduce state ownership model to the Americans, I just say, hey, this is no different from McDonald's. McDonald's actually has company-owned units and franchise units. And the Chinese actually have the state-owned enterprises and also the private enterprises. Despite of all the subsidies to the SOEs are inefficient, but they serve a purpose. Okay, which I don't want to go over here. Just give you one statistics. The majority of China's exports are not actually carried out by the SOEs. They are actually done by the foreign multinationals and the private China's indigenous private enterprises. So there is no correlation between state subsidies and these sort of competitiveness in the export market. So, and China is having these SOEs because, because it gives you social stability. Just like McDonald's are having company-owned units, because company-owned units actually give you the brand name of the company. So this is, I think it's a different model, and the Americans need to actually get into this, right? Now, one more comment, actually. You were saying that the Americans are not really making a lot of money from China. And I see a banker sitting here, and bankers don't make mistakes, that the KFC actually makes more than 50% of the profit coming from the Chinese market. I think Fred can share with us, so this is basically that the decoupling is kind of hard precisely because the rise of China is that China is part of the value chain. It's producing for all the other countries. So we will see what happens, actually.
Yeah, I think, as was mentioned from the morning, we are too intertwined to have, separate divorce, decoupling in a 100% way. I think what will happen is weakening of the global value chain links as we face greater uncertainty. And you're already seeing that happen with the relocation of firms to the extent that they can do it. What we're seeing, if I'm observing, much like our friend at lunch from HSBC, when he was asking companies, to the extent that you don't have to make new investments, what you're doing is you're shifting capacity. But then when you come to the question of, okay, where am I going to expand? That's when I think you will see maybe more interesting patterns coming out. So I think you will see a change, a shift in the global value chains, and that's why I think RCEP is very important, because you're creating, again, a larger production base that can be exchanging to export to each other as well as to outside of the RCEP region. So if you look at surveys of companies, when they say, okay, how are you responding to the uncertainty due to the US-China trade war? Number one is relocation. Number two is deepening your local supply, right? So it will be a mix of those two. And what you will see is maybe less intertwined if this continues, but that means higher cost at the end of the day, right? And the final thing I would say is that we are only talking about goods. We should be looking at services as well as the movement of people, and movement of people not in the physical sense. With technology, you can do a lot of offshoring and outsourcing without actually physically moving. And I think that's another dimension of the emergence of the new global value chains that we need to think about.
Okay, we have 5 more minutes before I open to the.
I just
want to say something on investment. So when we think about decoupling, we often talk about trade, but in investment, we forget that the United States has passed a new law, FIRMA, which is a review of the CFIUS process. CFIUS is a Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. And under that new provision, we are now reviewing systematically investment coming into the United States and Silicon Valley from venture capital firms and private equity firms as well. So there is a constraint on there. And also, the Europeans are also doing that, and they have a CFIUS equivalent, a FIRMA equivalent in Germany and France now. There's collaboration on that. So the concern about investment and its target is obviously pretty much China. So both the Europeans and the Americans are very concerned about that. So aside from the typical competition laws that we have to review mergers and acquisitions, there's also a national security review, which is becoming much more strengthened.
Patrick.
Yeah, I just wanted an opportunity to put out something that I was intending to say about how I think the WTO could make a big difference to its fortunes by rethinking its mission. I think it has misspecified its mission for a very long time. Basically, the idea, if you talk about what is the WTO, it's a place where they write rules for trade, it's a place where they negotiate trade liberalization, and it's a place where they settle disputes. The one area that they have been notoriously unsuccessful in is market opening. I mean, everyone thinks of the WTO as this place where you go and punch people up to get them to open their markets. Well, it is that, but the results are pretty mixed, very modest, actually. The only true source of success in this is the 50 years of liberalization of trade and manufactures among rich countries. And that was a coordination job. That was driven by terms of trade concerns, and all the GATT had to do was to coordinate those negotiations. No developing country in the history of the institution has reduced an applied MFN tariff on the altar of a multilateral trade negotiation, ever. The only time that developing countries have moved their liberalisation stance is when they accede and get kind of arm-twisted to do that, and in the information technology agreements. Other than that, you won't find any. So, given that that is the record, my suggestion is that we should look at trade liberalisation as something that is not uniquely supplied by the WTO. It can be unilateral, and most of it actually probably is. A lot of it is preferential. What the WTO can do is consolidate that. But this would be a major shift in thinking. This would explain why we didn't have to have the Doha round. The Doha round was going to fail precisely because it was so intensive in market opening. So I just think that's a thought that's not given much airing, but I think it's absolutely fundamental.
A very quick question on the other area that is not addressed by the World Trade Organization, that is imbalances. Coming from Germany, of course, this is a sensitive topic in my home country, and I would like to refer to an observation of Joan Robinson almost 60 years ago. She said countries there with current account surpluses, or trade surpluses, she actually said, are exporting unemployment, which is creating some of the backlash against globalization. So should the WTO think about some mechanism to sanction surplus countries that would reduce the incentive to produce them?
This is monkey economics. Your trade account is a reflection of the fundamentals in your economy. Savings and investment, consumption and production. And inevitably, if you're consuming more than you're producing, or investing more than you're saving, you will have a current account imbalance. Now, that's the trade part of it. And that's why Trump's idea that America's being cheated if they run deficits, he doesn't say that he's cheating others by running surpluses. It's just nonsense. So I don't see, the imbalance issue is real, but it ain't about the trade account.
Yeah, of course, it's the capital account is as important. And as a matter of fact, yesterday there was a guest from Germany attending the dinner, and he has just released a major study on the rather stupid way Germans are investing their capital abroad. One economist put it that way: Germans are exporting Porsches and Mercedeses, and they get Greek government bonds and Lehman derivatives in return. But that's a sideshow. I have a final question before opening up to the plenary, to Marie Pangestu, and that is referring to the growing up process in the WTO. We recently saw that South Korea has declared itself a developed country, giving up some of the privileges that developing countries enjoy in the WTO. Apparently, the American president played a certain role in that process. Do you expect that other countries will follow that South Korean example, which would eliminate some of the criticism that Trump and others are expressing? And Patrick, if you want to come in as well.
No, I don't think so. I think, in the WTO anyway, developing country is kind of a self-declared status, and I think it makes a lot of sense for least developed countries, but in practice, when you talk about special and differential treatment, it's more about longer timelines and lower thresholds. But it's not really, in a way, not that significant. And actually, Indonesia, I've been arguing for Indonesia that we do need to revisit this issue about developing country. Whether or not we take the American definition where you have to satisfy all these 4 criteria, or you have a different interpretation. I think this is something but we do need to discuss it, because we need to move on, basically. And we have to recognize that we are emerging economies. We are a member of G20 after all, so we can't be forever a developing country. So, but how do we graduate? And maybe you don't graduate on all issues. On some issues, you still feel you are developing, but on some other issues you feel you're already developed.
Yeah, I just want to say very quickly, I don't think this is a discussion that can go anywhere on that basis, simply because whether you call yourself a developing country or not will never be negotiable. This is for domestic consumption. This is for regional consumption. Singapore insists it's a developing country and doesn't never want to change that, but they have declared that they will not use special and differential treatment. But they didn't give up anything. Korea didn't give up anything. The reason that this is such a toxic issue is because what's really behind this is we don't think you've opened your market up enough. It's about market access. It's about liberalization. It's not about the rules. And it just speaks to the point I was trying to make earlier. So I think it's actually a very unhelpful discussion the way it's been framed.
Okay. So we have about 15 minutes left. And the first question, the gentleman here, and then Alison, and then the gentleman behind you. We take those three, and then we have the panel respond. And if you please identify yourself. If
Sure.
Yeah.
Michael Enright, University of Hong Kong. 2 quick comments and then a question for Patrick. I thought the moderator actually was starting us with a joke when he talked about the popularity of globalization in Philippines, Vietnam, and India. Because if you look on the investment side, out of the 70 countries that the OECD rates in terms of investment openness, the Philippines is 70th last, India is 62nd, Vietnam 54, China is 65. So I guess those countries are in favor of some forms of globalization, but not others. In terms of decoupling, China has already decoupled itself in the financial sector, where foreign bank assets are less than 2% of total bank assets, where it's set up its own payment system to try to avoid the SWIFT and other Western systems. In terms of the internet, of the 20 most popular websites in Hong Kong, 16 of them are unavailable 10 miles north of us. And when it comes to the US blocking tech companies, it's amateur hour compared to what China has been doing. So the question becomes, to me, in the West, what's happening is people are saying, well, okay, globalization has proceeded on some areas, which have benefited some other countries, and it seems to be stopped in areas that we think would potentially benefit us. And the question to Patrick is, do you think that we can put all this on the table and negotiate it out? Because in order to do that, we basically have to get to a situation where US and China primarily say, okay, we understand that there are 2 different systems, and the only way that we can do business over the medium and long term is to negotiate the interfaces item by item. And then if the US and China reach a modus vivendi, then other countries will not be in the invidious position of having to choose. Do you think there's a chance that that's going to happen?
Alison.
Hello, thank you very much for sharing all those insights. My name is Alison. I am an Asia Global Fellow 2019. And today we discussed extensively about how technology is changing the global economy and our society. But the basic rules of the WTO were created much before this phenomenon, much before Alibaba, Amazon, and so on and so forth. So my question is, and many argue that the WTO should play a more active, a stronger role in the issues of e-commerce and digital economy. So I would love to hear your thoughts on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And
hi, good afternoon. I'm Ira Palapozon. I'm an Asia Global Fellow alumni from last year from the Philippines. And I just want to throw a thought out there. It's a timing issue. 2013, the Belt and Road Initiative was a policy statement by President Xi. 2015 was supposed to be the internal agreement of the ASEAN integration, with full implementation supposedly in 2025. And yet, as of 10 days ago, or 11 days ago, both President Duterte and even Prime Minister Lee of Singapore mentioned that there is still a need for closer integration among the ASEAN economies. Now, reading online, a number of scholars have said that the Belt and Road may have actually caused more fragmentation within ASEAN or a bit of a distraction. I don't know if it's anything that any of you would like to answer, but I'm just throwing it out there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Patrick, you had a question directed to
From Michael, yeah. I don't think I don't think it's so much a question of item-by-item negotiations. I think it's a question of doing something about the rules. You see, it's not so much state ownership that's the issue, it's state trading that's the issue. And it's linked to subsidies. And all that the GATT rule says about that is that you must work on the basis of commercial criteria. That's it. So I think they could do a lot more with those provisions and try to get some way, get a handle on what is acceptable and what isn't. So that would be one aspect of it. The other would be the subsidy rules. But the thing is, there's already considerable scope for getting in between trade flows with anti-dumping measures and countervailing duty measures. And I think that, maybe what they could be talking about is how to make better use of these in a way that is perceived to be reasonable. I think the chances of that negotiation are reasonably high, not now though, but maybe with a different administration in the US. I think that it would certainly be a conversation worth having, and I think it might go places.
I thought I'd say something about digital trade. I think if you look at the US-Japan agreement, part 1 agreement, whatever they want to call it, there isn't a provision on digital trade. So I think we do see that taking place. Trying to multilateralize that and deal within the WTO is pretty complex at this point in time. I think there's one thing that's quite interesting is if we think about digital trade and big data, which is a very important, people say, the oil of the global economy and so on. What people sometimes think about is that, well, democracies are very good at big data and, democracies have been because you have an open economy. What they sometimes forget is that a country like China, which doesn't necessarily worry too much about individuals' rights of their data, their personal data, and they are actually very successful in some of these health sectors where you need lots and lots of data to do experiments and to develop new devices. So the notion that somehow the Western countries are far ahead because they did big data and we have all these big companies like Google and I think is very misleading. And so getting to an agreement will be much more difficult at the international level than we might think because of the asymmetry in terms of the governments as well and digital rights protection, which varies a lot from the EU to the United States to China.
I think the e-commerce and digital economy are the two areas where China actually lead pretty well. And these are the two sectors where it's the private enterprises that lead. So that actually demonstrates market competition is a great thing. So, the best example is Alibaba vis-a-vis eBay, right? When eBay actually acquired EachNet back to 2003, its market share in the C2C segment was over 90%. But within 2 years, it lost all of these shares to Alibaba. So that actually shows that the Chinese companies, especially those private enterprises, they actually compete fiercely. So this is, I think this is something that I hope all the other countries can learn a lesson from China's experience, that is embracing globalization, embracing market competition.
On e-commerce, as you know, there's already what do they call it? Joint statement. Yeah, joint statement between 75 countries, something like that. Yeah, Indonesia is not a signatory, but China and the US are, and a number of ASEAN countries. So it's already happening as part of a conversation in the WTO, and it is already in regional agreements, like CPTPP is maybe the most advanced one. And when they were negotiating the RCEP, some elements of what was in CPTPP was also adopted in RCEP, not all of it. And also ASEAN has an e-commerce component. And the idea, I think, is that it will maybe by the next ministerial be launched as plurilateral negotiations. And it's an interesting experiment that I've been observing, that they've actually made it open, so that even if you're not one of the 75 countries, you can actually sit in and listen to all the submissions of proposals, and all the you can also access all the submission on the proposal. So that's what I was saying about open plurilateralism, right? We only have 2 models at the moment in the WTO on plurilateral agreement. The ITA, which was agreed plurilaterally but made MFN, that would be the more preferred option. Or the government procurement agreement, which was negotiated plurilaterally but not made MFN, which is more close, right? So this is going to be interesting. And it will focus on data flows as well as electronic commerce and trade. And there's this one very old issue, which is the moratorium on tariffs on electronic transmission which was agreed on in '95, right, when the WTO was created. And Indonesia doesn't want to, most countries want to eliminate this moratorium altogether, right? Oh, make it permanent, sorry. Make the moratorium permanent, so you don't put tariffs on electronic transmission because there's no value in it, right? But Indonesia, India, and I think a few other countries are still holding fast. I think it's a lack of understanding on the idea is that they still want to tax these electronic payments, and it's the payments that they're after. It's the income that they're after. But that's not the way you get at it. And we are having this big debate in Indonesia right now. But it doesn't address all the issues in digital economy. And the big debate this year in the G20, data free flow with trust. That was the Osaka objective, right? So parts of digital economy, e-commerce and all that will be in these agreements. But the moment you talk about what Mike Spence was talking about this morning about privacy, security, governance, payments, taxes, they don't really belong in the WTO. And I think there's a big question out there. Where does the international discussion on that happen? On BRI and whether it fragments ASEAN or not, I don't think so, even though there are bilateral agreements that are trying to happen between each of the ASEAN countries and BRI. But I think if I was to take an ASEAN position and if I could make a recommendation, and I've been saying this for a long time, going back to the importance of convergence in development. If China wanted to play a real role in capacity building for ASEAN and East Asia economic integration, BRI should support projects which are going to help us integrate. So infrastructure projects that involve at least 2 ASEAN countries that help us to integrate and help us to develop. And that's what the ASEAN should be fighting for. But unfortunately, we are not cohesive enough at the moment to do that. But I think in the near future, that may be something we should be fighting for. And we should be fighting for it to be like sustainable, standards and even multilateralize it. That's the way I would see it.
And we got 44 seconds left, so I think I'll close it at this juncture. One pressing final question, but very short.
Yes, very short. I'm Victor Mpondabanda. I'm the Asia Global Fellow 2019. One of the takeaways is this school of thought that we are all sinners. That's something that we have to unpack. But what I wanted to hear, particularly from Dr. Patrick Law, is the place that Africa has in the narrative. Because across the discussion, we have not talked about Africa. While in the background, the Indians, the Chinese, the Russians are quoting Africa separately. So what is it that Africa could bring to the table? Thank you.
Okay, so the question can be answered by Patrick, and that will be...
African countries are in varying degrees active in the WTO, some of them completely inactive and some of them not very active, and then one in particular very active, which is South Africa, and not always in a way that I humbly submit would be considered very constructive. But I think the real issue, the way I see it, and you will probably disagree with this, I don't know, but the comprehensive intercontinental free trade area is actually going to be a very important step in bringing Africa, if it's done right, if it doesn't just become a massive import substitution, continental import substitution arrangement, actually what it really needs to do is link up African countries. Because the amount of trade that is accounted for by intra-African flows is only about 15%. Which is way below anything anywhere else in the world. So it seems to me that that could be one of the really useful ways of leveraging an African presence more effectively in the WTO itself.
And we close on that slightly optimistic note. There is a future for world trade. There are options, and not everything is as bleak as some commentators are suggesting these days. So thank you very much. I trust you share my observation that despite the relatively late hour in today's conference, we had a very stimulating debate on the panel. Thank you very much for listening, and thanks, first of all, to our panelists.